I think I became aware of the pyramid looking the way it did. And really, in a lot of ways, the centerpiece of that is what we finished last week, was talking about forgiveness and repentance and reconciliation. What we're talking about next is a necessary item. And I wanted to talk about forgiveness and repentance and reconciliation first before we start talking about conflict. Partly because it's kind of getting things in the correct order. We have to determine what kind of lifestyle we're going to lead in our relationships with people in our lives. And that, namely, lifestyle is one of a lifestyle forgiveness, of living forgivingly. And that sets the stage then for how we handle conflict. And so the subtitle is Winning the Peace and Losing the Opportunity. In most cases, I think if I were to do a poll in any of the classes, of how many people love conflict, I would have empty classes. And it shows. You know where it shows? Is it shows in the depth of our relationships with each other. Because conflict is always seen as something that is a threat to the intimacy, the threat to the connectedness, because of some of the stereotypes we carry with us. So there are a few things that I want to assert right out of the gate when we start talking about this, and I start with two what I call fundamental assertions in terms of this whole issue of conflict. The first one is this, is dialogue is more important than destination. Most of the time, our conversations with each other are alternating monologues. One person says something, the other person says, oh, that reminds me, and they go off on their tangent, and we have these alternating monologues between two people and say, good talk, and we walk away, without really ever intersecting. And the challenge of listening is in terms of the dialogue. And remember, listening, asking open-ended questions, inviting people to tell us more is a dialogue, even though you may not feel like you're participating in it. In a lot of cases, we have to battle our own sense of our right to be heard by having these monologues rather than dialogue. Because ultimately, if I actually sacrifice enough of myself in a dialogue with somebody, I may walk away not having said anything, or no one ever asked me anything. But that's really not the point. Because in a sense, the reciprocality, the sense of dialogue that we get with people is really where two hearts meet. When somebody reveals themselves in authenticity, talks about the things that they are going through. Remember, vulnerability is, and I'm making a change on this definition, but vulnerability is the stuff you're going through right now, not the stuff that you found all your victory over. That's nice, that's great, but there's not very much risk. And in most cases, when you hear speakers talk and everything else, a lot of times they're telling you about past victories. They're not telling you about current struggles. And really, that's where vulnerability lives. And so when we're talking with one another and trying to understand this thing that we call conflict, we've got to be clear that the dialogue is important all by itself. I don't have to put a bow on it and say, there, now we agreed, now we disagree. Maybe the standard of conflict, again, we're going to define that today, but maybe the standard of conflict is to what degree do I understand the other person's world and where they're coming from more than me being understood. A lot of times when we get into these again, kind of conflicts with people, disagreements or whatever those might be, our point is to have our point known. Not really to be known, it's to have our point known. And that's where the challenge comes in when we're talking about conflict. So, Destination is more important, or dialogue is more important than our destination. Where we end is a lot of times we approach it from that point of view. I know what I want, I know the outcome I'm looking for, and all of my interaction with the person is geared toward that end. That's destination versus the dialogue. The second one is that conflict is the gateway to intimacy. Now, if you take that seriously, somebody may be having an oh crap moment. Because if I do everything I can to avoid conflict, what does that mean about the intimacy I experience? See, the point in time when I am known is when I am different from the other person. That's when I'm known. If we agree about everything all the time, then how can I really be known? Because all the person has to do is check themselves, and then they know what I feel and think and everything else. On the other hand, when I interact with somebody and I don't see it the same way they do, I don't feel it the same way they do, and we disagree, okay, over what the world is like or how people are or the things that they do or why they do these things, now there's an opportunity to be known. And that's why I say this all the time. Conflict is the gateway to intimacy. It is in my model too. It actually, in a lot of ways, it stands between forgiveness and intimacy. It stands between those two things. And it's that way for a purpose. So, let me show you this quote. The mark of community, the true biblical relationships, is not the absence of conflict. Now, by the way, just the absence of conflict is not the definition of peace either. Rather, it is the presence of a reconciling spirit. Some of us assume that there is something inherently wrong or amiss in a relationship that has disagreements or conflicts, but that really isn't the case. All relationships will have conflict, and and it is not the presence of differences or the presence of conflict that's problematic in a relationship. It is the lack of a reconciling spirit. That's why we talked about forgiveness first. That is fatal to Christian community and relationships. It isn't our differences that ultimately undermine Christian unity and Christian community in our relationships. It is our unwillingness to deal with our differences in a biblical manner. It is what we do with those differences that is critical. If we see conflict as fatal, as a threat to intimacy, as a threat to being known, then we will not deal with things in a biblical manner. Like Matthew 18 gets violated over and over and over again. When people have an issue with each other, instead of going directly to the person, which is what Matthew 18 tells us to do, we go to their supervisor and we triangulate, or we go to somebody above them. Why? Because that scares a spitless going to that person and saying, that really hurt. Or we've got a major disagreement. Are we willing, can we talk about this somehow? Inevitably, people that turn those issues that are disagreements into personal affronts makes it virtually impossible to resolve the differences. So when I disagree with you, now I am disagreeing with your person. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? So suddenly when I say I disagree, I'm attacking you as a person. Guess what's lurking in the background? Shame. Shame. Because when people see me as attacking their identity, instead of attacking their position, and not even attacking it, but questioning it. I mean, it doesn't, again, our caricatures really get in our way. But even that is the basis on which shame is lurking, because they are waiting for their identity to be exposed. And that is the identity of being a failure, never getting anything right, never knowing the right thing to say, blah, 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 whatever you want to say to that. So, what I said a minute ago is true, and it is the thing that gets in the way when we're talking about conflict is a caricature. Our ideas about conflict are caricatures of what really can be possible. A caricature represents, to represent or imitate an exaggerated, distorted manner. You've seen caricatures before, things like Elvis or Jay Leno. Back up. And the caricature is exaggeration of typical features of people, like Leno's chin or forehead or any of those things. And that's how we approach conflict. So when I begin to feel or sense that I am not agreeing with somebody, suddenly we are fighting. And if we're fighting, something really terrible is going to happen, and I'm out. I am dead out with this. So in light of that, let me show you a caricature of what fighting, quote unquote, conflict looks like.
Talk about lame.
You can change it if you want.
I don't care, it's up to you.
I can live with it if you can.
Yourself. Hey, I was just thinking, when we stopped for gas this morning, I think it was you who put the oil in.
Hey, if you're gonna say I didn't put the right kind in, you're wrong. I used 10W30. And besides, motor oil would have nothing to do with this accident.
True, but you can't latch the hood too well if you don't take the can out, you no-selling waste of space. I swear to God, you're worthless.
I'm sorry about your car, but don't call me worthless. I'm trying my best. I'm not my dad.
That's right, you're not your dad. You can sell a ketchup popsicle to a woman in white gloves.
Ketchup popsicle?
Yeah, I learned everything I know from him. I didn't have a father, and he looked out for me, but you, he was your real dad. You just took it for granted. Hey, I'm big, Justin Hill fix everything, so I'm allowed to be a moron.
Get out of the car! It's go time! You and me!
Look, Mommy, the Rhino's getting too close to the car.
He's just a little guy!
That's it, big boy. I'm gonna wail on you. You're gonna regret all the this job for me.
Hey, boys and girls, off the spur!
You don't want none of me. Think it through.
Come on, give me your best shot. I'll give you a free one. Let me have it. Come on, you can do better than that, can't you? Captain Limpers, try again. Hey, everybody, is there a window open? I feel a drag. Oh, in a case I would have called you mother. That was a good one.
Hey, prehistoric forest.
Listen to the background music.
I'm sorry. So sorry.
Richard, do I have a mark on my face? It really hurts.
Nope, nothing. I thought I hit you on the shoulder.
My shoulder doesn't hurt very much, but my face does. Right here. Not here or here so much, but right here.
Nope. Shake.
See, that's a caricature of conflict. And there's a certain level of truth behind that, because we end up, we see conflict as this hammers and tongs going after each other, saying nasty things, and then in the morning we act like nothing ever happened. And that's a caricature. The question is how do you fight? How do you handle conflict? That's what I want you to think about. Because pure glass people are willing to stand in with the discomfort of being misunderstood. And they're willing to stand there in that and persist long enough to know the other person and then also be known. See, most of the time when we bail out of conflict, we bail out of depth in the relationship. Because there is so much waiting for us there if we just persist. And that's really, if we're going to change any of these patterns, really the only way to do it is to hang in and get all the way through it to the very end. It doesn't mean we agree. It doesn't mean that instantly anything will change. But I now know something I would not have otherwise known without the person actually sharing with me maybe the impact of my choices on their behavior. Maybe it's even more some other aspects of that. So usually what happens, and what question we have to ask, is what is your ultimate goal? When you decide to move into and say something that has been hurtful or something with another person, what is your ultimate goal? To be known? Or to extract an apology, or what? Because if I'm going to go after some item, some information, some sense of knowledge, some acquiescence, some apology or whatever, now we're back into what we talked about last time, and that is a tug of war. On the other hand, if I go into it with, I care about this relationship. I want to be known. I want to know that other person. I want to understand what's going on here. That's it. Probably three of the most powerful words you can utter in these places of disagreement is help me understand. Just that question alone is loaded. Because one, it says, I don't. And two, it says, I want to understand. But you're the only one that can help me know that. You're really the only person that can help me know that. And that's really what we're talking about. So when it comes right down to it, either our goal is to increase the depth, increase the connection in the relationship I have, or it's whatever the outcome is that I've decided it is, whatever that is. Like I said a minute ago, is the absence of conflict is not peace. As a matter of fact, healthy conflict results in a healthy peace. Because peace is wholeness. It is being known and knowing another person. That's peace. Ironically, that is also the word shalom. Is creating a sense of connectedness and peace in a relationship. And conflict is part of that. There is a phrase, Latin phrase from, I believe, the Persian Empire that said, if you want peace, prepare for war. Now that doesn't mean war in the sense that we're talking about here. But if I'm going to shrink from conflict, then I probably am not going to have peace. What I will do is become a peacekeeper and make sure that nothing ever happens between us. So if anything goes south, it's like, no, it's no big deal. And I've often made this comparison before, is people that handle conflict in these ways that I'm describing are like two porcupines on a cold winter's night. They get too far apart, there's no warmth, they get too close, they poke each other. But they find just the right distance apart from one another to not poke but have warmth. And we call that peace, rather than moving into this. So what I want to unpack is each of those goals. So when the relationship is the goal, what kinds of strategies do I tend to use? And if the outcome is the goal, what kind of strategies do I tend to use? And the challenge in that is that 4 out of the 5, let me figure out my numbers here. 4 out of the 5 of these we will do. But it doesn't mean that it's not healthy, okay? So if we start with the relationship, let's just say, you say, all right, look, I want to do everything I can to keep this relationship intact. I want to value it enough to allow this to happen, but what strategies do I tend to end up with? And the first one is yield. Is we acquiesce. And so we don't see eye to eye, there's a misunderstanding, somebody has said something rude, whatever that is, and we say, no, it's no big deal, and we back down and we yield to the other person. Now, the issue with yielding isn't that we do this. There are times, plenty of times, where I voluntarily stand down so that I can have a greater connection and be able to have a continuing conversation. There's plenty of times that I do that, but I choose to do that. I don't choose to do this or do this as a trade for the other person to do the same. If yielding is the only thing I do, it will create a seedbed of resentment. Because I'm constantly yielding, and inevitably over time, I begin to say, I'm really getting tired of all this yielding crap that I'm doing. It's about time this other person does that. And you see where we land. We land into trades. I'm yielding, you should too. And that's the danger of it. So I'm not saying yielding itself, in and of itself, is problematic. There are plenty of appropriate times to stand down, decrease the heat in the room, and start again and try again. The other thing that people will do is withdraw. And at the risk oftentimes of being perceived as overgeneralizing, a lot of guys do this one. I can say that because I'm one. So we do something wrong and we go scurrying for the cave and hope that the storm passes. And once it passes, then everything's good. And it's fine. It's like them sitting at the restaurant and music, I'm sorry, playing in the background. Everything looks fine. Everything's okay. It's not a problem. And the reality is, at some level, a lot of us do this. It's not just guys or men or women at all. We will do it emotionally. And in a lot of cases, we will do it as a punishment to the other person. So we look at, which is kind of odd, because when you think about it, we don't necessarily think our presence is all that important until we realize that it's a leverage point to get somebody back into relationship. So we withdraw and punish the person with our absence, and they stand down and come looking for us. And in a lot of relationships, it creates kind of a push-pull kind of relationship where one person withdraws and this person over here is the person that's having the conflict. They stand down and start to pursue. And the problem is that the distance always stays the same. So this person says, okay, I'm done. I'm going to come back out. And this person says, I'm done. They start, and now we're back to this. So the distance between these two people stay the same, and they end up withdrawing or pushing in or demanding or confronting or whatever. The other person withdraws, and you have this complementary pattern that really persists. It's a very stable pattern in relationships. So typically, we will take one of these two and say, look, I want to try to keep the relationship intact. I'm going to pull out for the time being. Then I will go back in. Now, the other side of that coin is outcome. What is outcome? Well, winning the argument, having a sense of being known, getting the apology I deserve, any number of outcomes that we have that we're looking for. And usually our threshold for tolerating the ambiguity in the relationship and not being understood and everything, that threshold is relatively low. So usually if we were to persist a little bit beyond it, we might actually get to the place where the two people understand each other's point of view. Maybe somebody said something out of line, and they offer it voluntarily. It's not extracted, and we begin to relate. So, two other strategies come out of outcome. The first one is win and lose. So the minute something starts going south, somebody gets afraid, and they start pressing in, and the winning is I keep this person in relationship with me. That's the outcome. I don't want them to move away from me. I don't want to feel distant from them, whatever that is. And so the other side of that coin is I have a point to make, and I'm going to make it, and that person better understand it and appreciate the profundity of it, and then we're good. So I win the battle. The danger is that in win and lose battles, everybody loses. Everybody loses. So there's that strategy, and then the next one that comes up is compromise. Now, like I said, at any given point in any conflict, there's a necessity oftentimes to find some middle ground. And compromise is that. It's like 50-50. I'll come 50% on my point, and then the other person will too, and we'll find this middle ground. The problem is compromise is an intermediate point. It is not an end point. So once compromise is attained and we're able to work together over whatever the issue is, it's going to have to be renegotiated somewhere. And the basis for most compromise is, again, a trade. It's a trade. I'm going to give up this point, etc. Now, a lot of times we don't see our arguments or conflicts with people in these terms. When we generally, in most cases, why we run away from conflict is because of how afraid we get of losing the relationship. And so winning the argument really then turns to not so much the relationship as me and me being known. So we will engage in at least 3 of these. The only thing that is fatal to most relationships is winning and losing. It never works out. That's why I said everybody loses. But there is a 5th, and the 5th one comes into resolve. And we often, you will hear conflict resolution, right? And conflict management. The reason I put it this way graphically is that resolution often includes all three of those at any given point in time. It never includes winning and losing as a strategy. So what that means is that the people that are in this relationship and engaging in this kind of interaction, at times they will compromise for the time being, then revisit it, come back to it, and talk some more about it. And that's typical. That's not unusual. Or at any given point in time, somebody might yield, or somebody might actually withdraw for the time being. There are plenty of times where couples that I've talked to over the years that are at hammers and tongs with one another. I mean, every time a word comes out of the other person's mouth, it's contested. And in a lot of cases, I have to kind of call a timeout. It's when I feel like a referee at times, and say, go to your opposite corners. And then I become a parent. It's like, you need to think about what you should have said. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, no, don't do that. But sometimes we need to withdraw and, like I said, kind of decrease the heat in the room and reevaluate how we got to this point. Ultimately, when we're talking about resolution, it's a lot like what we were talking about with reconciliation. So these things fold together because resolution requires both people evaluating themselves in terms of their role in the relationship. Most of the time, we get way south in terms of our conflict with each other and other people because we think we're entitled to something from them, or that we've been hurt. And that's why I wanted to talk about forgiveness and repentance and reconciliation before we ever get here, because this is where the heat rises. And if we don't put in place a lifestyle of understanding what forgiveness really looks like, what repentance really looks like, then how am I going to resolve something with somebody else? It overlaps entirely with reconciliation and the nature of what goes into it. So the key part of that is always going to be resolution. It requires a different set of skills that is committed to being known and things like that. So the one thing I will mention here is something from Max Lucado. Conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. In most cases, the heat rises with the level of the fear that we have, and that is very much a part of what goes into and helps us to understand why conflict is so important. It's inevitable. We're different from one another. We see the world differently. And the one thing you have to keep in mind is, in spite of the fact we're using the same words, it does not mean the same thing than the other, whatever the person is. So when I talk about fear, each one of you displays fear differently. Everybody does, because we experience it differently given our experiences and what fear means and where it takes us and all that goes into that. And so the idea of conflict being the gateway to intimacy is really valuing conflict. And a lot of times students will walk away from this talk and say, I got it. Conflict means intimacy. And the minute they get into conflict, they're so overwhelmed with fear that they withdraw. Or they do something else that they have always done. That's a normal part. I mean, if we're going to find a way to do conflict differently, we can't stop conflict from happening, or we'll never be able to practice. Well, you say, boy, that's a high stakes practice. Well, it depends on the person you're doing it with, I guess. Because ultimately, again, if we're working through and trying to infuse our relationships with grace, grace makes it possible for conflict to be constructive. Not all conflict is destructive. That's the caricature. And everybody comes from different families in terms of how conflict is handled. I can tell you, I think most of you guys know, I evaluate candidates for missionary service. And one of the key questions I ask them, and how they answer it tells me a lot, is, how did your family handle conflict? Now, what that tells me is so much more than, yeah, we were pretty normal. Exactly how do you define that? Because when somebody goes onto a missionary field, suddenly they become family with somebody, and guess where their skills and their abilities and the things that they do in conflict show up? Most missionaries don't complain about the nationals they're ministering to. They don't. They complain about the people they work with. And that's usually where a lot of times the most wounding happens for a lot of people in missionary service. So conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. Now, where does this take us? It takes us to intimacy, is where it takes us. And where we visited was this pyramid. I reminded you at the very beginning of this, so when we're talking about pure glass people, we looked at the pyramid and we unpacked it in terms of each of these qualities of truth and reality, and the control and boundaries and forgiveness and reconciliation. And we've gone to the point now of conflict. And what you begin to notice is that how does somebody who handles truth and reality, like we were talking about, how do they do conflict? Because truth matters, but both sets of truth matter. Not just big T truth. Little t truth matters in conflict. A lot of times that's usually where most of the people are battling, is that my truth is the truth and yours isn't. So the conflict, and how do they handle forgiveness and reconciliation, or how do they handle boundaries? All of these things inevitably build upon each other. Because what we do with truth, what we do with reality, impacts everything else that happens thereafter. which takes us then to the very last one in terms of intimacy. And I borrowed from a great poet.
To infinity and beyond.
And we will replace it with intimacy. To intimacy and beyond. I'm glad you like that. I worked really hard on it. Yes, this is the crazy mind of your professor, is what that is. I get bored with them. I just got to make them interesting for me. So if you like it, great. If you don't, tough. So now, in a lot of cases, when we start talking about intimacy, we think of it as a continuous thing. Once I achieve intimacy, now we're there. Everything's great. But I would suggest to you that intimacy is actually a moment in time. And it is a string of moments in time where two hearts are now known to one another. It is not an ever-increasing, ever-rising trend line of intimacy between two people. It just isn't. Talk about big T truth. That's one of them. Because our little T truths intertwined with each other, intertwine with one another, and where we cross is the potential for intimacy. And so when we have to look at it and understand that we are not talking about intimacy as a continuing feature. It is something that is moments in time that we intersect and understand one another. The question I have for you is which space will you live in? What exactly does that mean? When two people start interacting with one another, there are three different spaces that are part of the process when you have two people talking. One is the space in my head. The other is the space in your head. And the third is the space between us. The question is what space will you live in? The space in your head, having conversations with the person in your head, and them with you in their head? Or are you going to live in the space between you, where true intimacy lies? Intimacy and risk always go together. Remember what I said at the very beginning when we were talking about control. Control and trust don't coexist. Intimacy and risk always coexist. And that is what happens with the space between us. The space in your head is the safest place on earth. Well, depends on the commentator. But you'll choose a known dragon over an unknown angel that exists out here in this space between us. For a long time, I was actually thinking about this as a something to write about, as the space between us. And I was reminded of the classic comment that either starts Star Trek or ends Star Trek, and that is space, the final frontier. Yes, the space between us is truly the final frontier. It's the most dangerous place between us because things happen and risk occurs. So what space are you going to live in with it? So what is it? I had a friend of mine that once said, you know what intimacy is? It's defined as into me see. Being able to be seen. The Merriam-Webster dictionary makes something of a personal or private nature known especially publicly or formally. The small groups I have you guys engaging in was an invitation to intimacy. A lot of people were pretty scared about that thing because not only in intimacy, there's authenticity waiting, because how do we engage it? What else is waiting? Vulnerability. All of those things are really the component parts of it. So, into me see. So, the first thing we have to ask when we're talking about connecting and talking about this thing called intimacy is it's all about being known and knowing other people. We like to talk about that a lot, but most of our interactions with people are not necessarily in service to this thing. Now, I can know facts about somebody, but that doesn't tell me anything. I mean, if somebody were to send me a box of all the information possible to be collected about any one of you, frightening thought, and I sifted through all of those pieces of information, I still wouldn't know you. I still wouldn't know you. Why? Because being known is about having our hearts be known. It's not just the facts of the information or the facts of the person. I can't describe my wife to any one of you. I can tell you the features of my wife. I can tell you the characteristics of her. I can tell you all of those things, but that does not know her. Not like I do. And that's true for any of us. And that's the key when we're talking about intimacy. So, the first thing we have to ask, if we're going to enter into this thing, and I've been spending the last 5-6 weeks walking our way through and trying to answer this question, how well do I know me? Well, there's a prerequisite to knowing me. It's self-acceptance. You can't know what you won't accept. You can't. Because if you don't accept it, then why would you bother knowing it? It doesn't make any sense. You're given a specimen to get to know. You're motivated for whatever the reason might be. But how well do I know myself? Because that's the beginning point. And I have to fight through this issue of acceptance. So the thing that we have to contend with is if I've not done the work necessary to know myself, then how in the world am I going to share it with somebody else? You say to somebody, you're free to tell me what's going on within you. And sometimes, if they were really honest, they would say, I can't. Because I do everything I can to avoid knowing anything about what's going on in there. So we just kind of BS our way through it, say all the generic things that most people say, and the other person is going to say, oh, nice. Never knew that. Versus saying, that tells me nothing. I can pick anybody out of a crowd and come up with that. Why? Because we filter through the things that are the riskiest. We do. We filter them through. So, I can't give away something I don't own. I would add to that, I can't give away something I won't accept either. So, think about the arc of this semester. Where did we start? Because we started talking about the idea of safe people, the idea of boundaries. We got into and talked about grace, about the ability to accept ourselves as we are, not as we should be. See, these are the building blocks that come to being able to engage in the kind of intimacy that is just downright frightening. Why? Because if somebody knows me and knows me fully, then either all I got left is grace to survive in this relationship because they know everything there is to know as much as I know about it. Sometimes they will make some conclusions about it that I may not have told them about. But see that now, why do we not understand grace? Because we don't go deep enough. We don't take enough risks. Now, that's not saying everybody's safe. Now, don't hear me. I'm not saying go out there and pull the next 5 people coming out of the door and telling them your deepest secrets. I'm not saying that. We've already established that. So, if I don't own my heart, then I'm going to have a pretty tough time giving it away to anyone else. You can't give away what you don't own. You know, one of the things that I say consistently whenever I'm marrying a couple is that one thing. is own your heart enough so that you have an opportunity then to give it away. And that's part of it. So when we talk about intimacy, we have to answer the question, why is it so important? Well, first and foremost, it's important because it's essential for growth. Some of you guys know the experiment that was done, or not really experiment, it was kind of a observational study in Romania. After the Iron Curtain fell, a lot of Romanian orphans were left cast adrift in a lot of orphanages, and the caretakers ratio of caretaker to kids was like 1 to 50. And all the kids got their physical needs taken care of, and a lot of them died. Because it wasn't their physical needs, it was intimacy, being known by somebody, being touched by somebody, being cared for by somebody. It is essential for growth. In psychology, we have something referred to as failure to thrive. The kids get all the food they need. They get all the sleep they need. They get all the hygiene. They don't have the connection. And it is absolutely necessary for growth. The second thing is that it is essential for love. That's why I say the level of intimacy we have is directly related to the love we experience. I have little... Another philosopher of our time. This quote is, this one's worth framing. I'll tell you ahead of time. I'll just read it to you. If some of you guys want it, you're welcome to it. It's by Leo Buscaglia. It goes this way. Some people are convinced that they are emotionally safe when they remain guarded, unexposed, and thick-skinned. They are cautious not to truly reveal themselves for fear in being seen for who they are. They will be exposed and ultimately left defenseless. Protected and unassailable, their relationships never go beyond a superficial level. At the same time, they lament the absence of the deep intimacy necessary for love. When we defend, protect, and guard, we isolate ourselves into loneliness. We may escape severe emotional trauma, but in so doing, we miss the ultimate joys of true intimacy. Only by allowing ourselves to be vulnerable do we stand a chance at succeeding in love. If in the end we are deceived, betrayed, or tricked, we can at least say we tried. And in a sense, we have succeeded if we do not allow the scars of experience to cause us to develop a thick and impenetrable skin. We've succeeded. When we gain the insight to realize that vulnerability is the soul of love, we will surely heal and try again. Thank you. So why is it important? It's essential for growth. It is essential for love. And finally, it is essential for community. We have varying levels of intimacy in community. You can't have intimacy in a community of 15,000 people or 1,500 people. You can't. But we have to understand what we live in, and what I refer to as the circles of community. We have people that would fall into this category that we would call intimates. They know everything about us. We have entered into the kind of intimacy that we've been talking about in the last 15, 20 minutes. And intimates accept us as we are. But we have other people that also fit what we might call our best friends. They may not have the level of understanding and knowledge of us, but they have a lot. And in often cases, if you want to measure it in a sense, there are lots of things that happen on this campus that display this interplay. Because the people, the best friends, are the people we're hanging out with a lot. Or the intimates, I should say. The best friends, we'll stop and we'll talk and we'll see how they're doing and things like that, whether in the lobby or we'll stop on the path, the highway to heaven over here, or whatever. I won't add the other alternative. But we'll stop and check. They're best friends. And then everybody outside of that would fall into this circle of community that I call acquaintances. There are a lot of people we know by face, we know their name, been in class with them, can wave and all of that good stuff. But that's probably about the extent of it. We're not very prone to just slow down and interact and find out more information about them and things like that. The remarkable thing about people who are really good at connecting with people is they manage to figure out a way to have their acquaintances feel like they're their best friend because of the questions they ask and the things that they do. That is really remarkable. They stop, and then everyone else that fits out in the world outside of us. So the circles of community we have to keep in mind, because we can't be intimate with everybody. We can't. We're really not designed that way. I don't care if you're an introvert or extrovert. It doesn't matter. Now, extroverts tend to get pretty distracted by all this out here. And guess what happens is they don't really know much about this in here when they try to connect, because they haven't explored the contours of their own heart and the landscape of their own heart. Or use another term that I've used with you guys, is they haven't really spent much time caring for their well. So, one last quote and then some questions. This quote is from C.S. Lewis. You probably may or may not have seen this before. It's from The Four Loves. And he says this: to love it all, oh, that's awful, is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. There's one animation I will never use again. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Sorry. Yeah, suck it up, Buttercup. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness, but in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Great minds think alike. The soul of love is vulnerability. To love it all is to be vulnerable. What does Brené Brown say? To feel is to be vulnerable. We spend a lot of our time avoiding vulnerability, and in so doing, we avoid connection. And that's the danger. It's always going to be the danger. We live in danger everywhere. There's some that's more important to us than others. So the question I want to ask you guys is this: what kind of relationship do you want? This is the punchline of the semester. What kind of relationship do you want? Because, either we look at, back up. I think my daughter got into this one. Either we choose a you should relationship, or, and I'm going to kill you, a Me Too relationship. What do I mean? Relationships that are built on parameters and laws and criteria and everything else are you should relationships. They are clean, they are tidy, they are predictable, and they're sterile. We tell people how they should be, and they say, well, I'll never be that. And then we perpetuate a sense of hopelessness. A Me Too relationship is not one that just says Me Too all the time. It's one that it commits oneself to know the other enough to relate and connect to some experience you have had as well. And that's the Me Too relationship that we're talking about. somehow we've gotten this strange notion that connecting with people on a Me Too level is condoning whatever it is that they're doing, and they will continue to do it. And it might. It might. But I don't know about you guys, but I know for me, when I might be spiraling out of control and doing things that I really shouldn't, I don't need somebody to tell me what I should do. I need somebody to come alongside of me and say, yeah, I get it. So let's try another journey, shall we? That's a different thing altogether. And if I say no, they respect my no. I've had interactions with people like that. And the people that do that end up leaving an imprint on my soul that changes me down the road, and maybe not immediately. So, what kind of relationship do you want is one question. The other question is what kind of community do you create? It's not so much what kind of community are we a part of, because that goes back to the relationships we have. Is it a you should community, or is it a me too community? I think you can probably guess which community is marked by shame and which community is marked by grace. There are lots and lots of people that I talk to, and they're entitled to the conclusions they make. I am not arguing a point. But there are lots and lots of people that believe that somehow emphasizing grace is giving people a license to sin. And my response to them is emphasizing grace gives people a motivation not to. That's the bigger issue. It is not my job. It is above my pay grade to stop anybody from doing anything. Now, obviously, if they're going to kill somebody or kill themselves, I need to intervene. But 99% of our interactions with people are not predicated on that. And I can cast it as life-threatening, but I think we have to contend with, do I trust God or don't I? Not in just word, but in my most precious relationships. Do I trust God with that person? In abstract, intellectual way, yeah, sure. But then I'm still busy at trying to save them from themselves, which gets us into boundaries, which gets us into what kind of person we're going to be, which gets us into all the other dimensions of the pure glass people that we were talking about. So I leave you with these questions. Your answer to these are going to change over time. They always do. It's okay. I don't mind. I really don't. Because ultimately, for me at least, I would rather take people where they are rather than where they should be. And where they are is it, period. I don't evaluate where they should be. I can engage the conversation with them. I can encourage them. I can do a lot of things, but I can't make them do anything. We know that in our heart of hearts, but yet we make ourselves responsible for things we have no power over. So, I'm done. Any questions? Okay, I will see you next week for our debrief and our ending. See you then.